Perfect World International is an MMORPG that I have invested more time into probably than almost any other MMO out there, with the exception of World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV. Like, guys, I no-lifed this game from 2008 through 2010. I went ahead and I spent thousands of dollars in the cash shop to attempt to get as far ahead of everyone as I possibly could. And you know what? After investing thousands of dollars into the game, not only did I come to the realization that I was an idiot, but also that there were so many people that were spending more than me, that were getting further ahead than me. And at that point, I decided that it was time for me to just quit. But here we are, approximately 11 years later, going back into a part of my childhood and taking a look at the game, seeing if it is just nostalgia that leads me to believe that it was a good game and that it is still possibly a good game, or if it has turned into absolute pay-to-win garbage. So let's start this off first and foremost by talking about the classes that are available in game. For starters, there are many more races here than were available when I played. When I played, there were only the human, the untamed, and the winged elves. Each race had 2 different classes respectively, but since then, there have also been the addition of the Tideborn, the Earthguard, and the Nightshade. Now, first and foremost, oh my god, look at some of these characters. I forgot how elaborative and how extensive the character creator in Perfect World was. I forgot that you could make characters that look this bizarre. Worth noting is that each race has their own individual classes that are associated specifically with them. As an example here, the Nightshade have the Duskblade and the Stormbringer. The Earthguard have the Seeker and the Mystic. The Tideborn have the Psychic and the Assassin. Oh my god. Wow, that is, oh my, I'm not gonna be able to get that out of my head. That is gonna give me nightmares for days. But as is apparent, the winged elves have the clerics and the archer. The untamed have the barbarian and the venomancer, and the humans have the blade master and the wizard. Now, when I played Perfect World back in 2008, I mained a Vitality Blade Master. This meant that I could tank not as well as a barbarian could, but I could tank pretty damn well, and I was almost unkillable in PvP unless I was ganked by like 3 people. Now, there were 2 other classes, the Technician and the Edge Runner. These classes are completely separate from all of the other classes. I'm not sure why that is. They seem to be humans. They ride the same flying mount that the humans ride, but instead of just adding that as an additional class, or adding them rather as additional classes, they have their own unique class selection and their own distinct character creator. I went with the Technician because, I mean, while the Edge Runner, the guy looks pretty cool, I felt like she looked cooler and she might use a more fun, more entertaining, more engaging combat style. Now, before we go any further, I do want to note that there is a substantial difference between the character creator in the original selection of classes and then the character creator that was introduced with this new set of classes. Here is an example of the masterpiece I created using the old creator, using the cleric, and I mean, you know, evidently you can create something truly horrifying if you try. Or maybe you guys are into something like that. I don't know, no judgment here. But as you can see, the character creator for the new updated classes utilizes a completely different character creator. It has a set of sliders and actually gives you much more control over your character's face than the old one does. So I made my character, I went ahead and I jumped right into the game, and I realized no longer did we start in our own unique area, because back when I played, if you, as an example here, started as a human, you would start in Aetherblade City. If you started as an untamed, you'd start all the way over to the west in the City of the Lost, and if you were a winged elf, you'd start down south in the City of the Plume. So from what I can tell, they overhauled the leveling experience, at least from the 1 to 15 area, and they send everyone to the very same kind of like newbie tutorial island. A lot of games do this these days. I'm not really sure why. As a player that has been playing MMOs for, I think, more than half my life at this point, I know how to play an MMO. I know how to move. I know what abilities do. I know how to open my skill window. I know how to put statistics in if there are statistics that need putting in. But at the same time, this provides a more personal experience, I guess, because players are going to be able to see other players as opposed to everyone starting off in their own unique area, and then everyone, since each area is segregated from one another, feeling like their starter zone is potentially completely barren of other players. And one thing I realized upon first entering the game was that, oh my god, there were a plethora of not only new buttons to click, but new features. Like, there were so many. I was just absolutely lost. So, you know what, in retrospect, the newbie area might have been worth it, but it didn't actually go about explaining what any of those features were. Basically, it just led us from quest to quest until we inevitably hit level 15. And then it was like, okay, you're 15, time to get out of here. And before we go any further, I have to note here, I did play Perfect World back 11 years ago. And even back then, I was very disturbed by not only how our characters walked, but also by the sound effects our characters made when they ran and how high you can jump. Like, seriously, look at that. That is crazy. Oh, I just headbutted my microphone with my nose. But seriously, look at that. That is crazy. And admittedly, I have to find a new way of getting up close to my microphone without like moving my head all the way over here. Maybe I'll just like pull it over to my face next time. I don't know. Seriously though, the jumping in this game is just the most ridiculous thing I have ever seen. But the jumping is also partly due to the fact that this game employs flying. Not just flying, like World of Warcraft has flying. Final Fantasy XIV has flying. This game has flying, but it actually takes it to the next level because it allows for players to fight in the air. There is complete aerial combat. You can fly up hundreds of feet into the air. You can engage monsters. You can engage bosses. Like, there are large scale boss fights that take place in the air that also take place on the ground and take place underwater as well. And not just that, but since this game is very, very focused on PvP, open world PvP, instance territory wars, it adds so many different layers to combat. Being able to be on the floor, shooting someone, and then have someone come from 20, 30 feet above you and start shooting you with a barrage of arrows or spells, and then having to mount up and launch yourself at them to try and engage them, whilst also trying to deal with the people that are on the ground. This means that you have people that are fighting on the ground, you have people that are fighting in the air, and then, you know, if you're near a water source, you might have people fighting and shooting from the water as well. Worth noting though is that while there is in fact aerial combat, while you are in the air, you actually deal half damage, or more specifically, you deal half damage to players that are on the ground. So yeah, while fighting from the air might be ideal if you're trying to deal additional damage, if you're 1v1ing someone and they're on the ground and you're in the air, you're going to die twice as fast because you're reducing half your damage while they're dealing the maximum amount of damage they could be dealing. Speaking of the combat in Perfect World is tab target. Interestingly enough, I know this game is over a decade old. I know that I personally played it all the way back in 2008, but I did not recall the combat being this fun and this engaging. The special effects for the newer classes are much better looking. They are much more aesthetically appealing than the abilities for the old classes, because I remember the Blade Master had very basic looking abilities. The combat itself is very ping dependent though, because when I played this, I played it all the way back in Australia, and I used to have a ping of approximately 300 to 400. And let me tell you, having a 1 to 1.5 second delay on every input was crazy. I would pop a defensive, but by the time it would go off, I could be dead. I would use my charge ability, but by the time I reached my enemy, they would be literally like 10 feet away from me. Now, when I use my abilities on about 20 to 30 ping, they go through instantly. I can actually PvP. I can dodge enemies. I can dodge other players. And it is so much more engaging. It feels more intuitive because it actually responds to your input as opposed to being delayed by a second or two and having absolutely no idea where you're going to end up, where your ability is going to end up, whether your ability is actually going to trigger or not, or if you're attempting to, as the example here, stun another player or stun a boss mid-attack, and your stun actually goes off after their ability does. These are critical moments in combat that relied so heavily on ping that if you're playing from outside of North America or Europe, I would strongly advise you to just find another game. Or as an example here, use a VPN. I would personally go ahead and use something like exit lag. That's something that I promote because it actually works. If you guys are interested, I have a link to that down in the description and likely the pinned comment below. That will definitely help boost your ping in Perfect World and make this much more easier to deal with if you're playing from outside of North America or Europe. Now, going a little bit deeper into discussing the combat, interestingly, not only does this game rely very heavily on gear, but as I noted earlier in this video, I was a Vitality build Blade Master. This wasn't really done back when I played. Traditionally, they were Dexterity Strength builds to equip the best armor they could, but I wanted to be tankier so I wouldn't necessarily die when I was out fighting other players or when I was tanking bosses because there were no barbarians available at the time. Now, speaking of statistics in specific here, there is Vitality, Strength, Magic, and Dexterity. Vitality obviously affects your physical defense and your HP. Strength affects your physical damage. Magic affects your magic damage and your mana. And Dexterity affects things like your evasion and your damage if you're a ranged class. Now, interestingly enough, gear requires specific amounts of stats to be allocated. As an example here, as the class that I was, to equip light armor, I required a certain level of strength to equip my light armor. Whilst I would pump about 80%, maybe 85% dexterity, I needed to pump that 15 to 20% strength as well. Otherwise, I couldn't equip the gear for my level. And if I put in no vitality, then I would essentially be a glass cannon. So then you have to factor in how much vitality you want and overall how much HP you want, because if you're not careful, you won't be able to tank anything and you'll just ultimately die. And speaking of dying, I do not know how many times I died in this game trying to solo boss monsters. See, in this game, there exists a thing called a charm. There are HP charms and there are MP charms. These are things that traditionally you can purchase from the cash shop. I went into the cash shop personally. I looked around. There were just so many things in there. I had absolutely no idea what the majority of them were. I guarantee you there are plenty of very, very pay to win items in the cash shop. Everyone I asked said that the game was just as pay to win as it ever was. But I mean, as long as you're not trying to be super competitive, I don't really think that's really that much of an issue. But HP and MP charms, essentially, upon hitting 50% of your maximum HP or your maximum MP, automatically fill you right back up to full, meaning that you don't need to use potions as an example here, but they do in fact have a cooldown. Now, these are very important in PvP. These are very important when fighting bosses because there are times when your healer might not be able to top you up and they essentially prevent you from dying. Now, I went ahead here and I fought bosses specifically that were higher level than me, that were supposed to be done in a group. Now, utilizing those charms allowed for me to solo these bosses, solo these encounters, and ultimately finish these quests without the need of other players. But there were still times when I just couldn't do it because bosses like 2, maybe 3 shot me. And so I asked in the guild that I was in, and every single time I asked for help, whether it was for an instance, whether it was just help killing a certain amount of monsters, or whether it was help with fighting a boss monster that was just much too powerful for me to tackle alone, there were always a plethora of people in the guild that I joined that were more than happy to come along and help me. So while I did notice that the community was just as toxic as it ever was, because this is a competitive open world PvP MMORPG, it is worth noting that there are plenty of really friendly people to be found in the game as well. Talking about other players though, is she really small, or did she like fall into the ground? Either way, someone should probably call someone about that, because I'm really not prepared to handle this either mentally or physically. Now, the leveling experience in Perfect World was always something that I kind of disliked. See, it was very slow. It used to require a lot of grinding monsters because there just weren't enough side quests to do to supplement the XP that you would not be getting from the main story. However, currently you get from 1 to 15 without any issue whatsoever. Leveling from 15 to 20 pretty much all just happens in Archosaur City. 20 to 40 was pretty traditional. It just took you to the outskirts. You'd go from quest to quest. You'd fight the occasional monster in between that would give you about 1% or 2. You pretty much stayed around the Archosaur area for a lot of the 20 to 40 experience. 40 through 50, however, is when things started to really slow down. It took me, I think I played for about a day and a half, maybe 2 days straight to get from 40 to 50. Now, I didn't play like 8 hours straight over the course of those 2 days, but I poured in hours each day nevertheless. And then the 50 to 60 experience slowed down even more. And I see that players have made it all the way to, I think like 105, which is crazy because when I played all the way back in 2008 to 2010, hitting level 89 and choosing your sage or demon cultivation path was generally considered to be almost impossible to obtain. So seeing people that are 105 now, it just blew my mind. Now, the reason that the leveling process slowed down so much is because you began to require hundreds of thousands of XP to level, and there were no main quests to do, meaning that you needed to use the new quest finder tool to go out and tackle the side quests, which, you know, isn't really that big of a deal if you have plenty of time, but the quest generally rewarded anywhere between 9,000 to maybe 20,000 XP, with the odd one giving something like 50 to 100,000, but that would leave you doing 5 quests, 10 quests, 15 quests consecutively before you'd actually acquire a single level up. And when you compare that to what you had been experiencing up until that point, the drastic decrease in leveling speed was very noticeable. So as is evident here, the leveling experience slows down drastically the higher you get, and it's not like that is uncommon in MMOs, but it was just so apparent as soon as I hit 40, and then again once I hit 50. The quests were much more spread out, they were much more sporadic, and that made the leveling experience much less enjoyable than it would have otherwise been if either it was faster or the quests were just located in closer proximity to one another. Now, overall, Perfect World International, since that's what I played, I didn't play the Malaysian version, I think it was, of Perfect World. This is specifically pertaining to Perfect World International. This game right here, again, was my childhood. Is it as good as I remember it being? It is much faster. The combat seems to be more polished because the newer classes have better, fancier, flashier looking abilities. The zones have been improved because they were added later on in the game's life, which meant that the textures look better. The overall graphical quality was better. The classes themselves look better. The new races look better. Everything about the game added, I think probably after 2014, is a substantial improvement over anything that I played in the game when I did back in 2008. But the game is just as pay to win as it ever was, as all Perfect World Entertainment games are. There is just so much to do in this game. There are so many activities. The world is completely open, meaning you can move to any point of it without any restriction whatsoever. This is something that really isn't done in many games in general, especially MMOs. So if you're looking for a game that has fairly well done tap target combat, if you're looking for a game that has an extensive character creator, if you're looking for a game that is literally completely open without restriction, then this is definitely a game that you should try taking a look at. This game has both its pros and its cons. Whether or not the pros outweigh the cons or the cons outweigh the pros is completely up to you as an individual, because your opinion is going to be entirely subjective, just like mine is. But to me, I would say Perfect World as it is, if you are looking to be competitive as a player, is not worth playing. But if you're looking to get into the game and have some casual fun with a bunch of players that are into PvP, that are friendly and helpful, and you are looking for a bunch of different PvP and PvE content to do, then this is totally worth investing time into. But those are just my thoughts. They are my impressions after pouring the last week into this game. What do you guys think though? Have you played Perfect World? Does this seem like something you might be interested in playing? Let me know down in the comment section below and let's talk about it. Anyway guys, that is it from me. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to subscribe for more content like this, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.
Someday soon I'm gonna make it. Yeah, all hard work's gonna be worth it. Ooh,